Okay, so we'll start now. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to the episode 8 of the series 2. So, many numbers. So, this is actually our 16th episode today, and culmination of our series, the second series for this financial year. So, Indian financial year starts from April and lasts till March. So, that's why we this is the culmination of the series for this financial year. So we started our first webinar series with a broad objective of ensuring that everyone understands EPR in its entirety. There are so many definitions of EPR which are floating around in the market today uh, that we wanted to bring some purity of thought in terms of what it means. What was the original proposition by Thomas Linquist when he coined the term? Uh, so that was the idea. And then we wanted to, again, go into depth of EPR, look at different implications, look at Indian regulations. And that's what was done in the very first year. We have also made sure that in almost all of our series, there is a good representation of state pollution control boards, the regulatory bodies, who play a very, very active role in making sure different aspects of EPR are covered well. Today, circular economy is being driven very intentfully by the Indian government. So what we are also wanting to make sure is that different perspectives on circular economy are very well understood by the very wide range of stakeholders. And most importantly, the social and environmental aspects, because supply chains are really ridden with risks of secondary raw materials. So whenever we are talking of waste, especially in emerging markets, it involves informal sector at large. And while it is important to formalize the informal sector, it is also critical to make sure that there are no risks in this sort of a supply chain. So this webinar series this year has focused a lot on circular economy. And when I use the term circular economy, we have essentially meant material circularity. We have not gone to the space of repairing, refurbishment, while we have talked about it in bits and pieces, but we have not gone into extreme depths of how should we look at, let's say, lengthening the life of a product. How do we think longevity? How do we think repair? We have had some dialogues, but the primary focus has been on material circularity. And one of the good things that we are seeing in India is a very strong drive towards material circularity. In many cases, we are seeing regulations being drafted. Indian government also came out with a list of critical raw materials in the last year, which is now being propelled very strongly. That how do we ensure that there is resilience from a material point of view at a country level. So there is very, very good amount of traction, and it is important that this traction is carried through. Eventually, we think, and I seem to at least believe that we will reach a place where government is also going to mandate use of recycled content in electronic products. At this point in time, that has not been the case. But the way this sort of thinking is being applied across different products, let's say plastics or batteries, I think once the material value chains are resilient, once we have access to good materials, great quality of recycling starts existing at a country level, risk-free supply chains come into being, we may also see that emerging. So a very, very warm welcome to all of you. I would especially like to thank our sponsors, Dell Technologies, Canon, and HP Enterprise for supporting these series. This has been of immense help, not just in ensuring that we are able to run this series on a continuous basis, but also to really bring scientific knowledge to the table and various perspectives, diverse views, not just from India, but across the world. I'd also like to specifically thank all the speakers who have agreed to today come on board. Thank you, Martijn. You have been doing fantastic work via the reports that you launch. I'm a huge fan of your reports, the gap reports. Would love to do something, very specifically for different sectors in India. Thank you, Merve, for coming today on board. Thank you, Dr. Shruti, Sandeep, and Russel, and then my own colleagues, Shripriya and Mani. So with that, I like to invite Martijn to give the keynote address. Martijn will be talking about closing material loops and the different aspects about it. So Martijn, over to you. Once again, a very, very warm welcome. Martin, you are on mute.
So thank you very much for the a kind introduction, and maybe I'll give a little bit a perspective on how I'm sort of approaching this topic, which is actually from three different perspectives. The first perspective is as a serial entrepreneur, initially in digital and media, and then in the circular economy, where.
Mike, camera.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Sorry, there was a slight disturbance. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I'll keep going. Yeah. So my first angle has been a circular entrepreneur, where I built one of the first upcycling facilities, extracting high quality materials out of tires. So really sort of using not just the rubber, but also the steel, but also the carbon black. So that's sort of one vantage point. The second has been the last 4 years, and before that in the board, when I was leading one of the foundations in the space, Circle Economy Foundation, and you heard a reference to the circularity gap reports. So the comments of the world is only 9.1 or 7.2 circular is a number that is always presented each year at the World Economic Forum. And then more recently, I made a transition to a venture capital fund that I'm with now called Regeneration.VC, which I think combines sort of those two worlds, like the vantage point of where can we have the biggest impact with above market returns, but of course backing entrepreneurs who are building companies in this space. So that's my approach. So I'll start a bit with the higher level picture, then zoom a bit in on the electronics space, and then hopefully I can tee it up for the great lineup of panelists that follow me. So if you look at the circularity gap report, and I think these are the numbers from 2022. You basically see a dramatic uptick of material use in the last century, and actually it's still accelerating and increasing. So even between the two recent COP events in Paris and Glasgow, we used another 500 billion tons of virgin materials. If I use another stat, in the last 10 years, we used more materials than in the complete previous century combined. So there has been just a massive amount of virgin materials being used. And of course, that has a very big impact on our planet. And if you sort of look a bit in that, it's sort of 100 billion tons of materials, a lot of the greenhouse gases, and the circularity rate is around 7.2%. And if you think about that, sort of what it means for a planet, there's sort of 9 planetary boundaries. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that. 6 of them have already been crossed, and a lot of them have to do with material extraction and use. And if you put that a little bit in perspective, I think we're already using more than one Earth now. But if you want to stay within the planetary boundaries, either we have to really decrease our footprint in a number of levels, or we have to basically duplicate our Earth about 4 times. And this is the data from the Earth overshoot movement. So I won't dwell too much on the circular cap. It's actually a great report that shows like how all the materials flow through the complete economy. We've also done 15 now across 15 countries. Would love to do one for India. And we've done a similar analysis also for about 55 cities now in the world. And it's really insightful because it really gives you a footprint on what's happening, but also interventions. And if you then look at a bit more detail, roughly 70% of all the emissions are driven by material extraction, and 90% of the land-based biodiversity, which is, a big component of that, of course, is the mining, but also the food sector and the built environment. So maybe in summary, we have to move away from the take, make, use and waste linear economy and move to a more circular. I think you mentioned in your introduction you're more focused on the cycling piece, which of course is critical. But there are a number of other strategies that I'll sort of discuss in a minute that are also crucial in order to get there. Because with just cycling alone, I think we will not solve this bigger issue. If you look at the e-waste sector, these are some of the stats. So it's about 50 million tons now, increasing to 110 tons by 2050. Sorry, that should be 2050. Currently less, the stats in the e-waste monitor, it's less than 20% connected, 2% of solid waste, 70% of hazardous waste, expected to grow 40% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, and a lot of cross-border shipments, which of course makes it this specific waste stream a bit more complicated. So what are the sort of universal strategies that you can sort of use? And in their circularity gap report, we've identified sort of 4. So one is, of course, how can you just use less materials? And that does not, I mean, of course, it's also how can you drive down consumption, but it's also being more smarter with materials. Like if you can make things smaller, use light weighting techniques. And in fact, if you look at the chip industry, of course, there has been a dramatic increase in, computing power per gram of product, right? So there's definitely a lot happening in that innovation. The second one, core strategy, is basically slow down the metabolism, right? So if you can extend the lifetime of products and use them longer, you then, the worst example, of course, is the single-use plastic versus something that, will take 10 years. If you use a product 100 times versus 1 time, you use way less materials. The third key strategy is how can you use more regenerative materials? And I'll give an example about it later. And then, of course, you have the very key, but not the only one, the cycling piece. Let me go back to my slideshow. So let me give you an example of each of them. And if you, I do feel, and it's often like, one of the things that is a bit more painful to discuss. But if you look at the amount of, electronics and gadgets that are used, it's increasing at a very, very high rate. And if you look at the amount of waste per capita, you of course see a big correlation with global GDP. So countries that have a high GDP produce way more waste. I think the good, but also the bad news is, of course, that a lot of countries are increasing their disposable income. And of course, like, places like India will be very populous in terms of number of people, but are also quite rapidly increasing disposable income, which is a good thing. But at the same time, people will start using more and more stuff every day. So the using less, not only on the lightweighting, but also in terms of do we really need and does all these devices really make us that happy, is a core question to ask. The second one is using slower. So here we're really talking about sort of the repair infrastructure, refurbishing, remanufacturing. And I think in some industries, you really sort of see that. And there are great examples from, for instance, a Dutch company called Fairphone, who makes a very modular phone. And if your camera is getting old, you basically replace that with a new camera and basically keep the rest of the phone intact. And there's some other examples. I think Bang & Olufsen has done a really good job in designing their speakers completely modular. Which basically enables it to repair it way easier. So it's not like glued together, but it has all screws, it's repairability. And there's also a lot of regulation coming. The Right to Repair Act was actually passed by the EU. It's expected to be copied by California. So you actually see a lot of the larger manufacturers now starting to design their products. And I think, Apple, for instance, is one of the companies that was quite resistant to that, but is actually now leading the way. The third example is regenerate and make clean. So I've been thinking a little bit about that for electronics. And one of the key elements is about 20 to 30% of the e-waste is actually the plastics in the electronics. And I think that's probably an area where you can really start thinking about using bio-based materials. And in addition to that, this is also how can you use renewable inputs in the manufacturing, right? So using wind and solar energy to produce the equipment as opposed to using fossil-based. And then the third element is the cycle use again. And you do see a lot of innovation here. We recently, with Regeneration, invested in a company called Great Parrot that basically has an AI camera and looks on top of the conveyor belts. It's currently used mostly for other waste streams, and basically identifies all the different elements: the Coca-Cola bottle, the Danone yogurt, etc. And then there's robots basically picking and selecting the waste streams. And of course, in electronics, you could also use AI and robots to really take things apart. If you look at the current infrastructure for electronics, it's mostly shredding and then harvesting the materials. And the critical framework I think you can use here is something we call the value hill. So let me take a second to sort of explain how this works. So if you start with the mining on the left of the diagram, you basically have the raw materials, and they're still, they're gold and copper and they're expensive, but compared to the total cost of the product, they're relatively cheap. If you look at the bill of materials. And as you make those components and you start adding value and develop devices, like an iPhone, which may retail for 1,000 euros, but only has maybe 10 or 20 euros in raw materials in it. What you try to do then, when you've climbed that hill, is not sort of go down that hill very rapidly on the other side and go straight back to materials, but see how you can actually keep that value at a very high level during that period. And that's, I think, where some of the other strategies that I described come in. So a lot is happening in this space, and by no means I can, like in my 10 minutes allocation, give you a complete overview. But one I think very encouraging is the Circular Economy Partnership, and they published their vision document in 2020. And when I was reviewing that, it basically incorporated a lot of the strategies that I spoke about in the different sort of life cycles of the product. So I think there's a lot of great things here. At the same time, it's easier to write a vision document than get like a global value chain, like electronics really moving in the right direction. And if you currently look at where we are, we're still producing waste at a higher rate than we actually can sort of collect and cycle. So a lot of work to be done, a lot of innovation happening, and very interested to hear the panelists sort of dive more into details. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Martijn.
you very much, Martijn. Go on, Shruti.
Yeah. Yes. So, Martijn, I have one question from the slides that you shared, especially on the last one, on the partnerships part. So, we've always seen this where if a new company comes up with a solution, it's usually the bigger companies, they either want to take over the company and make it a part of their business, make it a part of their conglomerate. So do you see such a transition happening even in the circularity industry, since you have worked, you have had conversations with so many big brands, and you mentioned, for example, Fairphones are already coming up with circular design products into the market. So how do you see that transition happening, and what does the market look like? Martijn, you're on mute. Sorry.
I mean, if you put it a bit in a global perspective and you compare the impact that circularity could have on biodiversity and global greenhouse gas emissions, and you compare it with the energy transition, we are still, I feel, at a very, very early stage, right? So there's these couple examples, Fairphone, who has reached a bit of scale, and companies to start looking at it. And of course, the most natural place to start is on the cycling because it's very visible and it's waste-based. But you're just starting to see companies incorporate these circular models in their initiatives. And basically, what we see is that the consumer brands and the companies that basically power the consumer brands are first to move. And I think that has a lot to do with that the consumer brands are under increasing regulatory pressure, because that's what often the politicians focus on. It's also the branding, right? So I think you sort of have seen that with the plastic waste. As soon as that hit the social media, companies started to really be active and show they had a lot of initiatives there. And I think a similar story is, I think, is very likely to happen also on the electronic side. And maybe the last component is if you look at the carbon footprint, a lot of the emissions are in scope 3, so basically in the supply chain and not within the sort of realms of the manufacturing. And if you want to address those greenhouse gas emissions, you often have to revert to circular economy and material strategies in order to do that. So we see them moving fast, but I would argue we're still at a really early phase in a very big transition.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Martijn, and thank you so much for your time as well today. So with this, I think we would now move on to the panel discussion. And Mani, should I begin with the introductions? Are we good to start?
Yeah, I guess so, Sripriya. But then before you go on with the introductions, I would like to quickly thank Martijn for his time and for sharing his views on this. In fact, one of the points that really caught my attention pretty early in the presentation that he made was about the 70% of the emissions today are actually coming out of the material extraction. That's what Martijn mentioned. And when I look at the recycling industry and looking at what we are attempting to do, we are trying to minimize that to the extent possible. In fact, if possible, eliminate it in the long run. So that really caught my eye. So thank you very much, Martijn. And Martijn must be wondering what happened. Pranshu suddenly morphed into a different shape, a completely different color, and of course, completely no hair. But then, well, yes, there was a little bit of a handshake in the background, Martijn. So yeah, so this is Mani. I'm also with Karo, Sambhav, and welcome to all the panelists. I'll let Sripriya introduce all, and then we can go forward. Go ahead, Sripriya.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think Pranshu had pretty much introduced all of them, but I'd like to invite one by one. So the first panelist for today is Merve Dekle. She's a sustainability transformation technologist from HPE. Then we have Dr. Shruti Sharma, a researcher and consultant of strategy and business sustainability at TERI School of Advanced Studies. Then we have our third panelist, Mr. Sandeep Kota. He's the ESG specialist with International Financial Corporation. And we have our fourth panelist, Mr. Russel Mascarenhas, Commodity Sales and Marketing at Glencore. So thank you so much. And I'm really excited for this panel discussion. Over to you, Mani.
Thank you. And thank you once again, Sripriya. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. And for the time, I also know that there's a fair bit of time that you spent in the background preparing for this webinar. And I'm so excited to see more than 100 people who are currently on the webinar to listen to us today. And this definitely involves some of our clients and also some others who are interested in the sector as well as in the subject. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking time out to joining us today. So given that we have a fairly large audience today, what I would really like is to start off with some of the basics. Today we are here to talk about ESG, and I don't want to break that ESG down. I would rather leave it to somebody. Every time that you are, at this point in time, I'm more like a little kid who wants to learn, and where better to learn than going back to school and then going to your professor and asking a question. And that's exactly what I'm going to do with Dr. Sharma out here. So, Dr. Sharma, can you dumb down this whole thing about ESG and how it is being adopted in the EEE industry, and how what are your views on how ESG will take us and where it will take us in the future? I'll leave that to you, Dr. Sharma. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Mani. Good afternoon to all my fellow panelists and to the audience here. And the question which you've asked me is to set the context and to demystify ESG. Now, ESG, when we look at ESG, it's used more like a buzzword nowadays. So there's a lot of ambiguity around ESG. So to understand ESG imperative for the EEE industry, I'll just give you certain context. So, and to start with, there is a quote by Albert Einstein in which I would like to start the panel discussion with, and it says that you cannot solve the problem by the thinking you used when you created them. So when we look at the current problems today, where we look at the frequency of increased climate change, where we look at collapsing economies, where we look at inequalities, where we look at geopolitical crisis, all the problems which we see today are very complex in nature, and we call them wicked problems. That is, we don't have a solution to it. So all these wicked problems, when we see, which are very complex, in nature, impose a lot of risks on us, mankind, and the most vulnerable, we see are the businesses currently. So when we look at it from the business perspective, and when we look at it from the business sustainability perspective, now here the survivability of businesses, are at stake. And that is why we talk about sustainability so much. And the need of business sustainability is more than ever. So when I talk at business sustainability, or I talk about just keeping that continuity on, is a big challenge for businesses across the world. And if you talk about the longevity of business, when you look at, there was a research which was done by McKinsey, and it said that in 2060, they surveyed Fortune 500 companies, and the lifespan was 80 years. And in 2018, when they again went and surveyed the lifespan of Fortune 500 companies, it was 18 years. So that's where what we can say that, most of the 75% of the Fortune 500 companies will not exist by 2030. There has been a volatile raw materials. The price of raw materials have been volatile. Energy prices have been volatile. There's been supply chain disruption. There's businesses have been facing a lot of problems just to keep the cash flow on. Regulations, as Martin already mentioned in this, regulations have been more stringent than ever. And there is an ask from stakeholder also. So there's been asked from the demand side also in changing the way businesses practice, the changing the way towards more sustainability. Now, when we look at sustainability, it's a very broad philosophy. If I look at sustainability, I consider it as a philosophy. Brundtland Commission has given a definition of sustainability, which says that meeting your current needs without compromising the need of future generation. Again, when we look at from the business side, there is a lot of intent. You ask any business, you ask any board of management, in any business, so there would be a lot of intent. Yes, we do want to do something in this area. But when you look at the action or implementation part, there's a huge deficit. So there is a huge intention to action deficit, which is because of the subjectivity which is around this whole sustainability, business sustainability, that how do you practice it? So this is where, when we talk about the ambiguity, where we look at sustainability as a philosophy, is where ESG as a concept steps in. So when we look at ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. Now, this term is not new, though we've been hearing ESG, post-COVID, this term has suddenly come into spotlight. Now, ESG as a term was first coined in 2004, and there was a report which was published by a few financial institutions and United Nations, Who Cares When, where this ESG term was coined. And till 2020, it was mostly used for ESG investing, where a lot of fund managers or investors used to map the risk of the companies, analyze risk of the companies using these parameters. So it was used more for the fund manager perspective. But post 2020, when we witnessed COVID and when whole supply chain was disrupted and the world was on a standstill, we realized that companies who were following ESG, or companies who had those parameters of ESG integrated into the strategy, were the ones who were more resilient, were the ones who were more sustainable, and the ones who survived through the whole crisis of COVID we were in. And that's where ESG moved from investing, and it got a strategic perspective to it. And that's since then we've been hearing these terms E, S, and G, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. Now, basically, these are those material parameters or indicators in a business which has the most impact from the environment perspective, social perspective, policy perspective. So when we look at the material aspect, we are using a concept which is known as a double materiality concept to analyze the risk and map the opportunities related to the business. Now, when we look at these double materiality concept, it is what kind of the impact which the business has towards the environment, community, social, or the policy making side, the outward impact, and we assess the risk of these ESG parameters on the business financial performance. So ESG, as I say, is an analytical framework. It is an analytical tool which shows the business a roadmap to practice sustainability, if in a very simple terms I use. So yes, if I go to the technical part, there are certain kind of frameworks and disclosures which are aimed towards certain goals and principles, which one of them is the SDGs goals. We have in India, we have NGRBCs, which is National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct. We have UNPRI, which is Principles of Responsible Investments. We have GHG Protocol, which is Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So these are the principles or the goals where your ESG as a strategy is aligned towards. There are certain reporting frameworks such as GRI, which has a multi-stakeholder focus. We have SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standard Board, which is investor focused. Currently, after COP28, we are hearing about TCFD, which is Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD. So there are numerous frameworks in which we talk about disclosing basically ESG indicators. These are non-financial indicators which has the maximum financial impact of an organization. We intend to identify these topics, and we need to strategize or build our strategies to see the impact, so that at least the risks to the businesses are reduced and we have a very positive impact. So in a nutshell, that is what, in a very simple way, this is what ESG is. And when I look at it from the sector perspective, the EE sector perspective, when I look at the ESG parameters here, and these are, when I look at it from the E component, where we talk about, when this EE sector, I look at certain parameters which are very material, again, which has a very high external and inward impact in terms of risks, which definitely is one of the important, is the e-waste, which we look at it from the e-waste. When we look at it from an Indian perspective, India is the third largest e-waste producer. So again, as Martin already talked about, the dumping, which is there, which is again, countries do dump their e-waste. India is one of the countries where a lot of e-waste is being dumped. India has its own third largest generator of e-waste. Then we talk about the water management in the E parameter. That is also one of the very critical parameters here, one of the material parameters in terms of the impact in terms of EE sector. We look at it from the critical mineral perspective. Also, EEE sector is one which has a very high impact in terms of ESG perspective. When I talk about the critical minerals here, yes, we are talking about copper, we are talking about iron, we are talking about gold, we are talking about all those minerals which are very critical mineral. When we look at it from an Indian perspective, we only have iron and bauxite or when reserves. So when again, there is a lot of politics which is around the critical mineral, and that is where the secondary sourcing, or when we look at urban mining instead of virgin mining comes is useful, or there is an opportunity which is related to it. There is where biodiversity impact, in fact Martin already mentioned, which is related, which is again related to the EE industry. When I look at it from the S category, it is again employee health and safety. It is product life cycle management, which are one of the few important parameters in the S domain. In the governance or the policy domain, typical critical to EE is generally your diversity, board diversity, which is there. Again, there are certain kind of policies where we talk about EPR, we talk about waste management, where there are a lot of policies which we look at it from the G perspective. So this is what, when we talk about ESG, the context of ESG, what does it do? So it helps you to analyze risk and map opportunity to the business, so that you create a positive you have a good a positive financial impact in terms of your top line and bottom line, both. And it's a way to practice sustainability. And I would end it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. That was, I guess there were a couple of bookfuls of information out there. So thank you very much. I only hope the audience caught on to many of the points that you mentioned. But yes, ESG started off quite some time back, but then it was more from an investor perspective. And post-COVID, and it has started taking that strategic shape that it should take. And by complying, I would not say even use the word complying, by paying attention and by making sure that you are catering to the E and the S and the G and the different elements that you mentioned in there. What you're actually doing is you're making sure that the health of your enterprise, your organization, is in good shape, and it is able to deliver to the strategic objectives that you might take, and hopefully, definitely, they achieve the financials also. So thanks a lot for bringing that to us. You talked about sustainability, and then in the context we have Merve from HPE here with us, and she is from the sustainability side. In fact, Merve, today the way we live our lives, we use up a lot of data, both from not just words, pictures, and in many ways, all of you, especially companies like yours, have encouraged us not to keep anything with us, but to keep it somewhere else and access it. So we kind of keep loan it out or kind of keep it elsewhere and try to look at it whenever we want. This brings to fore huge amount of data storage requirements, not just with ourselves. It kind of spans and it has gone global. So how do you talk about these data centers, these data storage requirements, their energy requirements, and their recycling requirements, etc., from a sustainability perspective? So how do you see them, and we would like to hear your perspective on that.
That's a great question. And just before answering the question, I would like to thank everyone for inviting me here. It's great to be here today. Going back to your question, yes, it is actually the reality. And when we look at it from a real life perspective, especially the social media activities like photos, videos, streams, it's like making people believe that activities that we make come with no cost. And we also see a culture shift from storing only the most important things to the storing everything. And when we look at it from an enterprise perspective, we are started to talking about generative AI, large language models, and etc. So businesses became a data-driven, massive amount of data-driven we're talking about. So when we see data, we need to think about processes like data collection, driving the meaningful data, and how it is stored, of course. I would like to give some stats here, because in just 2 years, studies expect that the data collection will reach to 460 exabytes daily. And obviously it won't be this massive data collection, which will grow each and every day. And another study also showed that organizations tend to use only 32% of the data that they collected. After understanding that reality and where it goes, what we do is we advise our customers to think of some of the considerations, such as, do you need to collect so many data? Or how often do you need to collect the data? Do you need to collect the data that often to begin with? Or like, how do you keep them? Where do you keep them? How long do you keep them? And etc. A lot of questions to be asked. What we want to do, in other words, is what changes we can make in the process, which will do the desired work while spending the less energy and optimizing the storage and backup systems. It's how to say, sort of shifting to a new mindset where there is sustainability involved in the process. Because what we see often, that these considerations are not part of organizations' data strategy. Just to give you an example, like at HP, we released a new dashboard that provides environmental impact of the IT asset. And this tool, of course, communicates with some of the components. And these components, they collect the data every 60 milliseconds. And the product team of the dashboard noticed that getting the data every 60 milliseconds is not really needed. So they have decided to collect the data much less often so that they can have a reduced capacity of the storage that will be used. I do not want to limit this IT efficiency subject with only data aspect. I would like to broaden the topic a little bit with other efficiency areas of the sustainability. Let me bring up a slide for you and I will continue talking about the other areas. Please let me know once you see the screen. I don't see it yet, by the way.
Yeah, it's visible. Although the content is yet to come.
Perfect, perfect. Yeah, this is how we call, like, we have the 5 key efficiency areas of the sustainable transformation. This is HPE's point of view on that. But the first one is actually the data efficiency that I just talked about. And I would like to continue with the next one, which is the software efficiency. So this aspect is about like using the softwares and tools that can help organizations to optimize their infrastructure. As an example, a software that identifies potential problems, do self-diagnosis, and correct them by using AI and ML, and doesn't even require operate to take any actions. So what we do, we always remind our customers to leverage any software and tool that will bring them an extra efficiency opportunities in their IT infrastructure and in their data centers. Another point from a software efficiency perspective is looking at the workloads and applications. Analyzing their environmental implications by using we call a 6R framework, which is often referred to retire, retain, replace, rehost, replatform, and refactor. This is basically the methodology over the workloads and applications. By using this methodology, customers can have understanding and visibility over their workloads and applications to make the right decisions through the efficiency in their IT estate. And one last point when it comes to the software, which is using the efficient coding languages. When they need to make changes in their applications, some of recent studies show that C and Rust as a coding language, it seems to be much more efficient. By only doing that, companies can actually get a reduced amount of energy consumption, which will eventually help with their IT efficiency. I will move to the next area, which is an equipment efficiency. And our approach is here doing the most amount of work with the least amount of equipment. In other words, make the equipment work as much as possible. And why it is important, according to the researchers across this industry, and usually we collect this stats from the Uptime Institute, the average utilization rate of a single server is 10% in non-virtualized environment and 30% for the virtualized or a containerized environment. It is relatively inefficient, and obviously there's a big room for improvement. And that's why our suggestions to the organizations as a simple first step is starting to monitor their utilization rates. After doing this, they may surprisingly come up with so many stranded capacities taking a physical space, if not virtualized, consuming energy and harming the environment. And the next area is an energy efficiency. What we want to do here, we want to get the most performance per watt of power. This means bringing existing equipment to the highest level of the utilization to avoid equipment that is idling. We already talked about the utilization part in the equipment efficiency, but I didn't really mention its impact in terms of the energy draw. Now I will focus on this part. There's another important topic comes from the Uptime Institute, which is the 40% of the servers around the world are older than 5 years old, doing a 7% of the entire work, and yet consume 66% of the data center power. In other words, those servers consuming tremendous amount of power, generating tremendous amount of heat, but not doing the equal amount of work with other servers, actually not even close. The message from this stats is usually updating the older servers and eliminating many through the consolidation will actually slash the big 66 numbers and reduce the overall energy consumption. Moving on to the next one, and this is the final one, is the resource efficiency. So this area is about everything else beside the IT stake that it takes to run the infrastructure. So we focus on how do we reduce the over-provisioning of the resources like cooling, for example, or down to the even people that manage, operate that infrastructure. We learned again from the studies that cooling often consumes twice more energy than the hardware. Therefore, each hardware counts, and avoiding the over-provisioning has a direct effect on cooling and human resources. So our advice is here to follow up new cooling systems, such as direct liquid cooling could be a great addition to the lower energy consumption and help customers to have the lower PUE, which is the power usage effectiveness of the data center, so that customers run their IT hardware in a much more efficient data center. These are all the key efficiency areas that HP has been thinking about and managed to put together. I hope that would be helpful for your question, Mani. This is where I stop in sharing.
Thank you, Merve. Thank you. And yeah, that is. So, was there anybody saying something? Okay. That is really helpful in the sense to understand that there are so many elements that one needs to look at. It's just driving the efficiencies as well as making sure that we are able to drive the sustainability through that in terms of looking at all the R's that we talked about. So taking all those elements together and looking at these 5 levels of efficiency, I think that's a very interesting strategy to follow. Thank you very much. And what was even more surprising to me was the data point, really, that only 32% of the data collected is used. And as you said that, I was just thinking about the kind of data that I am collecting or I start looking for. And the recent times, we truly don't look at deleting our mails, do we? We kind of keep all our mails. And earlier there used to be a point in time when all of us had a limit on our memory, and you had to kind of clear up your memory stacks, etc., etc. So you went about cleaning up what you didn't want. But today there seems to be unlimited, and we kind of keep that. So that's something that we can all work on, and all these are still sitting on the same servers that you're talking about, old or new, whichever way they are. So thank you very much for that, Merve. I would kind of move on to Sandeep. And thanks, Sandeep. I assume that it is pretty late for you there in Sydney, I understand. But so thank you very much for your time and your patience. And so what we were looking at is from an IFC kind of perspective. IFC is into establishing partnerships, especially from the in the public-private partnership area significantly. Now, and when I look at more into the waste space, especially the waste treatment space, waste recycling space, what are the interesting things that you've seen, innovative things that you've seen, or innovative best practices that you've seen, especially in the ESG, which kind of gives you the viewpoint to say that, okay, this enterprise can possibly do well, like Dr. Sharma pointed out, from a strategic perspective, from a financial perspective, so that an agency like IFC can partner with that enterprise. Over to you, Sandeep.
No, thanks a lot, Mani. Thanks for having me here. It's quite interesting hearing all the panelists speak about their experiences, right? So the question that you had posed is actually an interesting segue in trying to build a framework on how do we probably solve the entire circularity program. I mean, solving circularity program, I do understand it's a bit of stretch, but at least getting there, right? So, and I believe a first step in realizing to a solution for the circularity program is through the PPP, which is a public-private partnership model, which the government uses a tool to leverage the experience and expertise of the private sector and accelerate their pathways, right, for achieving the sustainable development. So when we look at PPPs, one of the key component of any PPP is to structure the transaction, and the structuring of the transaction is basically allocating the risk and the mitigation strategies across the public and private sector so that it maximizes the entire outcome, right? And which and also addressing the most urgent developing needs. Now, specifically when it comes to the waste management sector, so what I've seen is that the PPPs have two major issues that we normally encounter, right? So one is that there is very limited end of the treatment technologies that are available in the commercial space, right? And this is across all the waste sectors, right? Be it municipal solid waste, be it plastic, be it e-waste. So the high-end waste treatment technologies are very limited in space. The second thing is to actually achieve a financial viability because of the limitations in terms of the available technologies, you would require high capital investments for the byproduct markets, right? And which are actually very small to recover cost and ensure profitability. And in addition to all of this, while looking at the waste management transactions, investors such as IFC, we usually look at the entire supply chain, and as has been described earlier by Martijn, Dr. Shruti, and which you have alluded to right now, is that the entire supply chain is actually fraught with various ESG challenges, right? And it's across each node of the value chain. It's across the node where you actually collect the waste. It's across a node where you disassemble the waste, the recycling industry. So across each node of the value chain, you have some specific ESG challenges that you need to encounter, right? So be it child labor and the forced labor in the supply chain. And so if you are actually looking at partnering with the private sector for the government entity, so you also are looking at the redundancy issues, right? Which are a huge risk for any municipality when they look about the PPPs, right? So this is one risk that you typically need to look at. There are occupational health and safety risks, specifically when you are disassembling the electronic waste in the collection centers, and then you have life and fire safety risks, which are quite common across all, I mean, across all the nodes of the value chain while I was working in Indian subcontinent that I was looking into, right? So to address all these challenges for the transaction that we have worked on, so what we look at is the issue from an integrated approach, right? Instead of looking at it a piecemeal basis, I mean, even though you're looking at structuring the transaction only for, say, the waste to energy plant or any end of the life treatment. So you need to look at the entire value chain as an integrated approach and try to see what best tools are available for the public sector, for the private sector to mitigate these risks, right? For example, can you look at the private operator being responsible for the entire collection, transportation, and treatment to mitigate the risk from those sites? Whereas municipality actually retaining responsibility for certain processes such as door-to-door collection, so that you can reduce the impacts of the risk from the retrenchment or the redundancy of the existing workforce, right? The other thing was in India or in any other PPP transaction that we have worked in, one of the key component for the entire structuring to work through is how do you structure the tipping fee, right? I mean, what should be the quantum of the tipping fee? if you increase the tipping fee, it will not be affordable for the municipality. If you decrease the tipping fee, the financial viability of the project will not be there. In order to maintain the optimum level of tipping fee in some of the projects that we have worked, we introduced the capital grant and the concessional loan during the construction for the private sector, so as to manage the tipping fee. And while bidding out the transactions for tendering, the project was bid out based on the amount of the grant required for the private sector. So that's the amount of the VGF or the capital grant for the project to work. So that was the parameter that we looked at while bidding out the transaction. When we also bid out the transaction and when we had this bidder conferences, we also realized that people were concerned about their payment risk from the municipality, right? That's a significant risk. You establish a tipping fee, but what is the risk of you receiving the payment? And it's a significant risk. So in those areas, what we did was introducing an escrow mechanism and with a reserve so that you can actually release the payment. And while looking the entire transaction, as I was explaining earlier, the focus of IFC in structuring the transaction was to review the entire value chain from E&S perspective, and using performance standards, which are the framework for good international industry practice in E&S risk management, to identify the risk across each node of the value chain and develop specific mitigation measures to be included as an obligation in the concession agreement, right? So that the concession agreement can be bankable for the investors to fund the project or the private sector, right? So, for example, when you look at the responsible supply chain, right? So how do you have an obligation for that? Would be to include an obligation in PPP agreement for the concessionaire to actually develop a management system where the concessionaire undertakes the due diligence to account for and manage the risk across the supply chain, or in case he is actually using the services or delegating the responsibility to third party, you would probably include some representation or covenants on mitigating the risk, right, of the forced labor and the other risk in the supply chain for the concessionaire to manage. So these management systems are something that we typically look into. And the other key risk that we usually look at is in terms of the disposal of the rejects, right? So which is quite common in most of the waste management projects. So you establish a company to recycle the waste, you also have rejects, right? So how do you dispose of the reject? So in performance standards, so you have the requirement to for the private sector to maintain the chain of custody documentation, wherein you need to ensure that the hazardous rejects do not end up in the dump sites, creating land water contamination, and you need to maintain a chain of custody documentation to the final destination. So these were some of the ways that we could probably look at in mitigating the ESG risk across the entire value chain while structuring the transaction and incorporating them as part of the PPP agreement to make the transaction much more bankable for the investors to come in.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. In fact, when you talked about these, I guess I'm just pulled a little into the memory lane, really, because when Cardozo was formed about 7 years back, the fundamental goal was to move the entire sector, or at least part of the sector, from unorganized to organized, and help the unorganized sector understand the challenges that are there in the way they are operating, both from the E and the S and the G perspectives, all these perspectives, and how it is impacting the society as a whole, and how they can move and still continue to do in terms of the thing that they're doing, but avoiding and eliminating the wrong things that they were doing, whether it was environmental or social. You talked about child labor, you talked about damages to the environment in terms of groundwater pollution, etc., etc. You also talked about the governance aspect. So that is the fundamental premise with which Cardozo started. We were successful to an extent, and I'm sure you'll be aware we had partnered with IFC in doing some studies in this regard too. And then we moved on to become, we're now pivoting to become complete recycling because we're trying to bring the whole thing into the organized sector. That's where the whole purpose of our discussions are. And in the process, we're looking at, we already do the section of the collection, the entire supply chain, and we are very focused on every node of the supply chain, as you mentioned, and also to make sure that nothing actually goes into the landfill. And there are quite a bit of things that you talked about where there are no solutions. I'll just touch that when I come back around again. But we, in fact, have tons of material that we retained in safe custody so that we will recycle them when the right technologies come in. So that is the approach that Cardozo has, and that's the mindset that Cardozo has. So thank you very much for the points that you mentioned. We'll come back to you in a little while. Thanks again. Now, Russel has been patiently waiting. Thank you, Russel. Thanks a lot. And from Glencore, and being somebody who is into virgin mining as well as into recycling, and I keep looking at it saying, I keep kind of remembering what Martijn said at the beginning in terms of 70% emissions coming out of material extraction. Now, how do you think these partnerships that we are engaging in, okay, in terms of using recycled material for electronics, how do these partnerships, how is it pivotal in kind of ensuring and driving the circular economy? That's what I would like to ask you about.
Sure. Thanks first off, Mani, for the introduction and having Glencore as part of this important conversation.
Pleasure.
If I could just share my screen, I think it's always easier to talk with some pictures. I'll try to make this a little bit of a practical session, right? I think that's, from Glencore's perspective, that's important. So hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe just giving a brief word on Glencore and where sort of we sit in the supply chain. So as you mentioned, large mining company on the virgin side of production, as well as the recycling side. So recycling is not new to Glencore. We've been in the business for 75 plus years in different streams. So we recover copper, gold, silver, PGMs, nickel, cobalt, and several other byproduct metals from recycling processes. For us, scale is important, and that sort of touches on some points that were mentioned by panelists. How do you make an economic case? Well, scale for us is important, right? So we are one of the largest recyclers and product recyclers of waste electronics worldwide. Yeah, I guess to touch on your question, maybe we start with with just a little bit of an easy one. It's very easy to talk about the urban mine, right? But what actually is the urban mine? And I think when you get hands-on in the ground, that's where the challenges actually stem from, right? So we think, oh, there's a ton of material that you can easily access. It's not actually the case. So focusing on the recycling supply chain, I think how we see it is first on the scrap collection and dismantling, right? So you have basically materials, multi-metal materials that are mixed together. How do you actually take the valuable components or the components that you can best recover through a process and separate them out from the other? So typically ferrous away from non-ferrous, away from highly valuable metals like electronics, right? That's where we sort of rely on some partnerships. That's with actually private and also public. Maybe to give some figures there. What we see in Europe in terms of regulation is quite stark, right? So in the early 2000s, the EU put some regulation in place for a collection of waste electronic and equipment. Collection rates now in particular Western Europe are close to that 50% mark, whereas in a similar developed region, let's say North America, it's sub 15%, right? So that is an important piece there. So it's how do you connect the public, but then also the scrap collectors on the ground, right? People who are going to the OEM sites, picking up the waste production, the companies that actually deal with collecting end-of-life materials. That's very important. That's not our core business, but that's where we really rely on strong partners such as Karo Sambhav to help with that, right? On the pre-processing side, now that's really the recycling. We understand this well. Again, not our key business, but this is today, as someone mentioned, shredding is really the way, right? So you shred the material and then you try to separate. Is there better ways to do that? Here we see Glencore's role is also supporting the ecosystem, right? Which is, are there better tools, better technologies to separate those materials more effectively than just shredding, where you create a lot of, let's call it, unrecoverable material or lost material. And then getting to the processing and refining, this is really Glencore's bread and butter, right? So this is, how do we use our large-scale industrial assets to recover materials? So maybe, again, to give some figures, I've got some figures here. So on the copper side, in 2022, we recycled roughly around 32,000 tons of copper. That's from most of it from waste electronics. Now that's quite a sizable amount, one of probably the largest in the world, but compare that to our mining side, which we produce about 1 million tons of copper annually, right? So it's still very small, and we've been in this game for a long time. So how do we scale this up? That's really the problem we as Glencore are trying to solve. And then the last is refining, right? So getting it to a product that is then usable. So we bring that to an LME or LBMA standard. That's a commodity standard. And that's great. That's our business. But then what, right? So traditionally, Glencore has been, let's call it a tier 3 or tier 4 supplier to an OEM. So we supply, let's say, that copper to a rod producer or a wire producer. That wire production then goes to someone who specializes in a certain type of cable, which then goes into a piece of equipment. But how do we bring that together? So we really see this as where collaboration. So across the recycling chain, I think a lot of this already exists, but there's definitely lots of room for improvement. But then how do you connect basically the scrap collection and then the refining back to the end user, right? So today, and maybe a practical example of this today where we see this actually happening quite a bit is in the automotive sector. So again, traditionally we were tier 4 supplier to automotives. Today we are tier 1. So essentially they buy the metal directly from us, then they toll it through their through the next steps of production till they get a product that is usable for them. And that allows traceability, right? So traceability through the supply chain so that they can say, okay, well, now we have, let's call it production waste or maybe even end-of-life waste. How do we reallocate this back into the supply chain through the scrap collection, through the pre-processing, back to, again, a product that's usable for an OEM? So hopefully that sort of touches on the partnership aspects of it.
Thank you, Russell. That was brilliant. Thank you. In fact, these days when we are talking to OEMs in terms of secondary materials and secondary material supplies, as Karo Sambhav progresses to go into recycling of critical metals as well as some major plastic items. And when we're talking about secondary materials, we're talking to the OEMs to understand what would be the right specifications for these secondary materials and how they would, because we would like to structure our processes to deliver the secondary material that is required. And many times we realize that secondary materials or the raw materials actually goes, like what you said just now, as even as companies large as Glencore is a tier 4 level. So the spec is something which is not at the OEM level, but it is something tier 4 level. Now, how do you get into that as a tier 1? And that is a very interesting case for me to understand, hey, this is a very interesting suggestion, possibly a recommendation to the OEMs who serious about this in terms of using secondary materials in to kind of route it directly and ensure the traceability to be sure that they are getting the product with the level of secondary material inside as they would like. That's a fantastic one. In fact, the other thing that resonated very well, you should have, I guess you saw the clapping hands, the emoji run through your slide when you showed the original, the second one where there was a lot of copper junk that was around, and you mentioned the point about not being able to separate the material. Again, we resonate very strongly with you because many materials are integrated. There are composites, and you're not able to separate them. And this causes tremendous challenges when it comes to recycling and taking it out. Now, to talk about that, I mean, I'm kind of going into the second round of questions. I should have possibly gone back to Dr. Sharma to start the round again. But then that we are on the topic, I would kind of move to talk about how we can bring these materials into the products. Really, as we start the entire product life cycle from the design stage onwards to the end of life, so that we are actually able to recycle and get the right secondary materials without having this challenge of having to shredding it and wasting most of the materials. Merve, your thoughts on that, please.
Sure, Annie. I'm a big fan of, again, putting some slides, so let me also put one more slide.
If I could interrupt, we've had an excellent round one, so we kind of a little crunched on time on the round two, so I would just want to speed up the whole thing. Thank you.
Sure. I will quickly go with this one. It's also just one slide, but okay, this is the previous one. Yeah, and that's the one I wanted to show you. So I would like to show you what is HPE's approach to the IT lifecycle and its principles. I think it will really resonate with your question as well. So these are the design, basically, starting with design, manufacturing, customer use, and the end-of-use processes. The entire product life cycle serves as the foundation on how do we design our products for energy efficiency, longevity, easy to sample, repair, and recycle. I would like to start with for the design for environment. Because we obviously HPE cares so much about how do we design for the environment. Actually, our Design for Environment program is 3 decades old. Since 1992, we've been thinking of how do we design our products to be able to reduce its environmental impact. Simple example to that point, we don't glue the parts of the products. Instead, we merge them with screws. If we would glue them, what do we do when we want to get them apart? The answer is to break them. So if we break them, we can't really give them a second life. We don't want that. So we have to use the screws instead. This is just one of the many design methods that supports circular economy approach in the HPE. The second piece is the supply chain part. What we hear from our customers, like especially their procurement team, started asking this question: that how do we make sure that the vendors you're doing business with have a high set of expectations for their supply chain? So we have got about 2 decades of experience working with our suppliers. We made them acknowledge the code of conduct that considers the environmental aspects, health and safety aspects, their rights, human trafficking prevention, working conditions, work ethics, etc. Of course, we do not let them do all this by their own. We audit those suppliers regularly. We also launched a program that will require 80% of HPE manufacturing suppliers to set a science-based emission reduction targets in their own operations by 2025. By doing that, we are seeking to avoid 100 million tons of emissions. So it's a huge amount of emissions. It equates to taking like 21 million cars off the road for an entire year. That actually shows how big is the supplier chain's environmental impact in our industry. On top of that, last year in August, we rolled out a new request for our key suppliers to provide a more granular carbon footprint data for each goods we purchase from them. With that, we will have a better understanding, better calculate, and minimize our upstream footprint. When it comes to the customer use piece, I would say it is the most important phase because the biggest part of environmental footprint of the IT hardware lies on the stage of a customer use. And this phase's environmental impact accounts for 80 to 90% of the entire environmental footprint. This is the phase we're not controlling the IT hardware, but our customers are. Therefore, we have to focus on helping out the customers to get better. We work constantly on improving our wide variety of energy-efficient products, solution portfolio, as well as sharing our best practices with our customers. For example, our newest Gen 11 servers, they're saving power consumption per year up to 81% and reduces CO2 emissions up to 72% in comparison to the older generations. Also, we have our 100 supercomputers made it to the Green 500 list, which is where they rank the computers based on their performance per watt of power. So we know where to start. That's why we're really working on to making our portfolio is more energy efficient, even when it is not in our control. And finally, the end of use part. When the customer is done with the IT asset, it doesn't mean that the asset impact on the globe is done. And India is doing a remarkable job on that. Well, we do that in a global perspective. We'll take that back from them, even with this HPE gear or a third-party gear. We'll refurbish it if possible, and about 82% of the time we're able to do this to give them a second life. Almost all of the remainder is recycled, with less than 1% material is going to the landfills. As a note, our recycle processes also get audited by the third party to make sure that the things are moving as it is supposed to do. And when we look at the entire circle, starting from design, supply chain, customer use, and end of use, these are literally complex processes to deal with. So our suggestion is to consider as a service, which is the fifth element in the middle of the screen we see. This method basically helps to manage all aspects of that around the circle. As a service simply is an IT delivery model that enables organizations to use only what they need. Efficiency doesn't like redundancy. So as a service model is simply aligning with the IT efficiency since there's no over-provisioned IT hardware in this model, as well as the options around end of as a service contract. What we do, we take back the asset from our customers to refurbish for at least second use or recycle it responsibly. As a service model from a sustainability perspective helps with space, power, and cooling restrictions in the data center, as well as gaining energy and carbon savings. So I hope I was enough fast to answer your question.
Thank you, Merve. Thank you very much for that. In fact, after hearing Russell earlier and you now, kind of makes me think, maybe we, especially from a design perspective, we should wind back a fair bit. I was just remembering the old buildings, for that matter, constructions, where everything was exposed. The wiring was exposed, the switches were exposed, the plumbing was exposed. And this was like, I can, even if you would have possibly seen some of them, and it made servicing, replacement, anything was so much more easier instead of destroying an entire wall or something to actually access something. Now, while that is in a building, the same thing applies to a product too. And being a designer myself, I'm kind of wondering, well, we should kind of wind back, go back to our roots, and then find something, make it better, innovate on those. That's what I'm looking at. And kind of takes me on to a point where Dr. Sharma earlier talked about how ESG helps in the achieving strategic objectives of an organization, or even just the from a financial perspective and otherwise. Now, while Dr. Sharma said that, I would like to take views from Sandeep in terms of how does it from an investment perspective. When you are seeing it, you would have invested in organizations, and when you see that, how do you compare the performances, or in terms of in your experience, how are they fared? That's something that I would like to ask you about, Sandeep.
So Mani, whenever IFC invests in a project, right? So as part of our E&S sustainability policy, we need to do an appraisal of all the investment to assess if they are compliant with the performance standard requirements, right? So we have 8 performance standards, and we do compare the performance of the entire value chain, as I was mentioning to you earlier, because the value chain has significant industries across each node, right? So we do apply the principles of the performance standards and see on how they comply with the performance standard requirements. And as you're aware, you have more than about 120, 130 banks and financial institutions which have voluntarily adopted the equator principles, which are also based on PS, right? So, so this covers basically 80% of the finance transactions in the emerging markets. So whenever we are actually looking at investment from global investors, we are looking at on how the ESG management systems are integrated into the entire company's operations in addressing the risk and impacts across the value chain. And that's actually quite crucial to tap in investments from IFC and other equator signatory banks, right? And while I was also mentioning to you earlier in terms of the PPP structuring, right? So whenever we are structuring the PPP, we include as is mentioned, so we assess the risk and then develop the mitigation measures to be included in the obligations as part of the concession agreement, so that the outcome of the entire process is again aligned with the performance standard requirements, so which would make the transaction a bit more bankable and for them to tap into the funds from the global investors, right? And in to help in creating ecosystem per se, so we have also created a platform which is a circularity plus platform to accelerate the development of the sustainable waste solutions. And this is more like an advisory platform support to the waste management companies who are looking to develop the projects which are focused on circularity, so that we come in and advise these companies on how best to incorporate the performance standard requirements across their the portfolio, right? So that when IFC or any other global investor comes in and looks at the project, it would be easier for them to appraise it vis-a-vis the ESG requirements. So this is broadly, I know I'm short of time, so this is broadly what I wanted to cover in the short time span in terms of on how IFC looks at the ESG for the transactions that we work on, and how a better integration of ESG would open up to tap in a more wider asset range, right, for the investments.
Thank you very much for that, Sandeep. I know you are not just short in time, but you're pretty late in the evening too. Sorry, Russel, I'm not sure where you are based out of. If you can share that just for me.
In Switzerland, so it's all good on timing.
Thank you very much for that. Russel Mascarenhas can be anywhere for that matter in today's world. So thank you for that. I would just switch back to Dr. Sharma, really. Not many on the call here would know that you're an expert in policy frameworks and trading policies out here. Now, what we would just like to hear now from you is what policies and encouragement would you like to provide through policies for companies to switch to the kind of circular economy, as well as so that they're taking care of the environment, and also in terms of taking care of the social pressures and the social requirements that are there. And that's something that we would like to learn from you today.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mani. And when I say policy, whenever we look at, again, I mean, all of, except for me, I think all of the panelists are practitioners here. So we look at it from a much broader perspective when we look at circularity here from the policy making aspect. So again, starting with a very simple note, when we look at circularity, or when we look at, let me talk about ESG as a strategy. we, apart from analyzing risk or mapping opportunity from the business, when we look at it from a broader perspective, we use a systems thinking method. And when we use a systems thinking method, we follow the systems thinking where we say that environment and or societies where we live in, and development is what we do in order to survive. So unless and until whatever we do, all our activities are aligned with the environment or community in which we stay, it would not be sustainable, or it would not lead to a desired impact. So when we look at it from a policy making perspective, we always look at creating a shared value from the stakeholders, for all the stakeholders. So we don't look at it from a compartmental, we don't compartmentalize, it's more of a systemic view which we look at it. So from the circularity, we follow this approach where we talk about the base leadership approach from the policy making side, which starts with, when we look at ESG, again, it's nothing but compliances. So when, in emerging economies perspective, when we look at, especially from Indian perspective, when we look at most of the companies here, generally we are in a stage where it's more of an obligation for them to comply to all these regulations and framework. And that's where government is asking them to look this way. So when the government asks them to look this way, the first step which they work on is the waste and pollution. They look at the emission stream and they look at the waste management. That's the low hanging fruit, which we see. So once you have looked, or we call it operational optimization. So when you're looking at the first step, when you're obligated or made to look this way, you first look at the low hanging fruit, which the first step is waste and second is your emission. So you design out waste and pollution, so that is the step one where we look at designing out waste and pollution. And just designing out waste and pollution, you see a positive impact on your bottom line because it leads to waste efficiency and energy efficiency is where it comes at level one. So once that waste and energy efficiency is met by companies, they're obligated and they see the top line, the bottom line where they see the profits coming in terms of saving of the money is where they go to the another level where the policy making is drives them to, and that's a market-driven approach where we talk of innovation. And that is where sustainable innovation comes in, where the company starts looking its way and you start making products, which are market-driven products. You look at innovation there. Not taking much time, the third phase is product stewardship. Again, all of these are circular economy principles. That is where, you have your SDG 12, which is responsible consumption production, SDG 11, which is sustainable cities, and SDG 9, which is innovation, industry and industries. So these are three things which are directly based, the circular economy is based on these principles. So after innovation is the third level which companies go, which is product stewardship, and where you take full responsibility, a cradle to cradle approach of product. You start disclosing, disclosures come in, you start talking about it in public, your credibility comes in, your reputational risk is taken care of, your market risk is taken care of, transitional risk is taken care of, a lot of risks are being taken care of companies, and that's where they go to the fourth level and a final level where you do from an operational optimization to where you look at organizational transformation in terms of policies, where you go for an ecosystem building, and it's there where you create a shared value, not for the 1/3 stakeholder, but for the 2/3 underprivileged one, who are not the taxpayers of the country. And that's what beautifully, I think in Martin's talk, you were mentioning that how do you include them, and circular economy is an enabler. This is one of the practice which includes the rag pickers. When you say these are the from the rag pickers or the ones we call the invisible ones into the society, we call them circular warriors, and that's where you create a shared value, and that's where we call them ecosystem building. So policy making is generally when we work towards the policy, we have a bigger picture in mind where we look at how do you create a shared value for everybody, for the community, society, and nation in general, which starts from the basic principle of waste and pollution mitigation. Thank you.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. In fact, it kind of took me to spaces where when I work on operational excellence on shop floors sometimes. So we talk about restoring basic, restored back to the basics. So fundamentally, it is in terms of cleaning up the emissions, so it's not the emissions, the waste and everything, restoring the condition back, like restoring basic conditions, and then go into innovation, look for sustenance. How do you sustain the innovations that you make? Now, the system thinking that you're bringing in terms of looking at it from an organization transformation perspective to bring in the shared value and starting off from the very floor to clean up and take it up with the innovation. Thank you very much for giving that insight. Much appreciated. Thanks a lot. Now, the man country to be in, and then we're talking about base out here as well. Anyway, so you talked about how you are now moved from a tier 4 to a tier 1 supplier in terms of providing secondary materials to clients. Now, how is that being looked at, and how's the response been to that, and how do you see more and more OEMs moving towards that practice and taking material from the secondary materials from recyclers like you?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's some interesting things here when we made that switch, or we're making continually that switch, right? So I would say on the OEM side, on the brand side, there is a want, right? So there is a fundamental demand. I mean, you can see it starting in Europe, particularly. So we see it in items such as green steel. They have premiums actually to primary steel. You see it on the battery metals. So depending where it's produced, there's in the West typically cleaner produced materials. You'll have a premium to, let's call it, materials in Asia, where the ESG criteria is a bit more strained, right? So I think there's a fundamental need now. Some of the challenge that comes with that is you've gone from an OEM who's maybe used to buying a component or a part, and now they're buying a commodity or a metal, and that brings some challenges. So they don't know about hedging. So price volatility in metals is quite significant. You can have, it's not uncommon to have 100% price swings in a year. An OEM is not used to that. So we often see this as a service, as Merve mentioned previously, come up a lot, right? This concept of service rather than dealing with the actual title and risk of material. Then there's also the certification problem, right? So we see, yes, I love recycled material. I want it certificated as well. So last year, actually 2 years ago, we trialed copper certification with 2 very large industrial customers. These are Glencore certified. It was more of just a pilot run to see what the demand was. And it was good. Now, that's a good start. But if you have Glencore giving their own certification, you have other companies giving their own certification, well, what is an OEM supposed to rely on, right? So standardization of that becomes quite important. So that's also on the ESG side, right? So when I buy a metal, how do I know this is comparable to the same metal being produced by another producer? Those are challenges which we see the OEMs facing, and how we're trying to close that gap, but that is still a gap today because it is relatively new. And lastly, I'll say pricing premium, right? So I want the recycled material, but I want it at discount. That's something we hear quite a bit. So should there be actually a premium for recycling? It's a question that I think dictated by supply and demand a little bit. But if the ESG criteria is higher, if there's more work required, someone has to pay for that, right? So we see that as a developing trend in many metals as well, which is, could there be a premium for recycled materials? Well, I think the demand side will dictate that. And we do see that already coming in, especially in the battery metal space. Some driven, but then also some really it's demand driven, right? So the OEM is saying, no, I require it to be that, and I'm willing to pay more for it because it has all of these good things which we want.
Yeah. Thank you, Russell. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. In fact, I think the last one makes up for most of the other things that you said, really, in terms of the pricing pressure. Most people expect that a secondary material, primarily coming out of waste, as it is otherwise looked at, should be far cheaper than virgin material. But then, unfortunately, that is not the case. Unfortunately, if the cost of collection, dismantling, processing, and generation of this material for that matter is there is a certain cost to it, and possibly bringing it to the levels of standards that they are talking about, it involves a certain premium too. So that's very valid point. And yes, we're already seeing that. Today, people are governed by regulations and driven by regulations, so to speak. But otherwise, once it becomes more voluntary, once it becomes more, let's say, taking Dr. Sharma's words in terms of the strategically looking at the whole thing in terms of looking at it from the global perspective, then maybe that premium possibly will be good, will be given to us. Maybe that's possible. And in fact, when I said dismantling, that was because we didn't shred anything straight away. We tried to dismantle right down to the pieces that is required. Anyway, thank you very much, Russell. Thanks thanks to all of you, Merve, Sandeep, and Dr. Sharma. Thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing such wonderful points on the subject. And I'm sure that there must be questions around. I would request you to stay on for a couple of more minutes if that's possible, and take questions if there are any. But from my side, sincere thanks, and over to you, Shruti.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion. But Mani, I think this discussion was so insightful that I think a lot of people are still absorbing the content. So we do not have questions in the chat today. So I think we can move on with the closing remarks.
Oh, then, okay. So that brings the mic back to me. So thank you very much. I mean, I'm not surprised, Shruti, that there are no questions, because the topic today is not a very simple one. It needs a lot of absorption, and it needs a lot of, let's say, introspection in many people. And we have touched on multiple aspects. I mean, we talked about what ESG is. We talked about policy. We talked about design. We talked about how sustainability and how that impacts. We talked about recycling and how we can move material, secondary material, higher up into the supply chain hierarchy, and how from a partnership in terms of financial partnership, and how one of the largest finance corporations in the world looks at the whole thing and how they are able to support this partnership, build and grow. Now, these are not easy aspects for everybody to take in, but then I'm sure when the questions come, we can kind of direct it to the right panelist and seek their answers over mail and pass the responses back. So thank you once again. Thank you very much to all of you. In fact, I should also have duty bound to also thank our sponsors who have made sure that these two series have worked very well, and which is Apple, Dell, Canon, and HP Enterprises. And of course, Merve is here, and our friend Manjari is also has been on the call. So thank you very much, all of you. Thanks for the sponsorship. Thanks for being here. And a huge thanks to the audience. There are a fair bit of the audience, a large part of the audience was still on the call, still listening to us. I much appreciate this. Thanks a lot, and have a great year closing. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.